This is Bluebeard. The man, the myth, the folkloric entity who murders his wives and keeps their bloody bodies locked up in a room in his house. I'd guess that most of you will be at least a little bit familiar with the Bluebeard folktale, but if not, it boils down to this. A young woman marries a man and is whisked off to live with him in his house. She's encouraged to settle in and make herself at home. However, there is one room her husband warns her she must never enter. The door is kept firmly locked, and whatever lies beyond is strictly off limits. The young woman disobeys this order, enters the room, and to her horror, discovers the grisly remains of her new husband's former wives, of which she is but the latest in a long line. Once you know the story, you see it everywhere. It's no secret that there have been, and continue to be, countless Bluebeard retellings and adaptations. Stories, poems, plays, films, operas, and these retellings span many, many centuries. Bluebeard is a lasting cultural sensation. The question I'm interested in answering here today is, why? Why are we so obsessed with the plight of this woman and the horrors she is forced to face? Is it the tension, the drama, the gore? Or is there something else at play? Something darkly relatable that sets our teeth on edge and keeps us forever returning to the locked room and the horrors it conceals. In this video, I'm going to examine 3 very different, very distinct Bluebeard short stories. Charles Perrault's La Barbe Bleue, Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, and Nalo Hopkinson's The Glass Bottle Trick. I'm going to demonstrate how these writers, who span countries, cultures, and time periods, take the Bluebeard myth and spin it into a powerful narrative that speaks to their distinct contemporary anxieties and beliefs. And I'll use these stories to show you how, over time, the moral of the story has changed. From a parabolesque tale that reinforces gender stereotypes, to a decadent feminist remaster, to a dark fantasy supernatural revenge tale steeped in Caribbean folklore, Bluebeard's message, its core principle, shapeshifts. Do these stories warn women to toe the line and listen to their husbands? Or do they reward their ingenuity, their bravery? Did curiosity kill the wife? Or did it set her free? Let's find out. But before we unlock the door and begin our journey, welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe, this is Mousy the mushy, scrooshy, smushy baby, and we make analytical video essays on all things book, so please subscribe if that's your jam. We're forever grateful to our patrons over on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube for supporting us in the making of our videos. Thank you so much, and if you'd like to join them, there's a link down below. Before we get cracking, please be aware that this video contains discussions of domestic and sexual abuse, murder, mutilation, body horror, gore, colorism, pregnancy, and child loss, so please keep that in mind as we begin with our first Bluebeard tale. One of, if not the earliest Bluebeard tales set down in print, Charles Perrault's 1697 classic La Barbe Bleue, which, unsurprisingly, translates to The Blue Beard. Just a quick aside here, Perrault's tale was originally written in French, and it's been translated by lots of different people, even by Angela Carter herself, which is very interesting for what it throws up about the difference between translation and adaptation, where that line is, and if there even is a line, and we'll get to that later. But basically, this means that the version I'm quoting from, which isn't actually, in fact, Carter's, but this one, translated by Christopher Betts, will probably be at least a little bit different to the others. As well as being the oldest of the 3 Bluebeard stories I'll be analysing today, Perrault's La Barbe Bleue is the most straightforward. It's the shortest of the 3, and it's very to the point. Compared to Carter and Hopkinson, whose stories we'll get to shortly, Perrault's prose is very plain. But this plainness, the simplicity of Perrault's language and the straightforwardness of his storytelling is, I believe, deliberate, and has an important effect on the way we interpret the story. It makes La Barbe Bleue read like a classic moral tale, a fairy tale, a parable. Something clear, definitive, and uncomplicated. In places, it almost reads like a nursery rhyme, like in this dialogue between the protagonist and her sister, Anne. So, for context, this is close to the climax of the story. Bluebeard has found out his wife has discovered his secret, and he's sent her upstairs to say her final prayers before he mutilates and murders her. And hey, say what you want about his bloodthirsty misogyny, at least he gives her a minute to gather herself. Not all men would do that. The protagonist, however, has other ideas and is upstairs trying to buy herself time as her sister, Anne, keeps watch out of the window to see if their brothers are coming to rescue her, and all the while the protagonist is asking, What can you see, Sister Anne, Sister Anne? Is anyone coming this way? This refrain, with its sing-song, nursery rhyme quality, is repeated 4 times, and it reminds me of the back and forth we get in something like Red Riding Hood and the, "Oh, Grandmama, what big eyes you have! Oh, Grandmama, what big ears you have!" Now, why is this significant, you might wonder? What does it matter if La Barbe Bleue reads like a fairy tale or a parable? Well, traditionally, fairy tales and parables tend to conclude by having the protagonist and the reader learn an important moral lesson. By adopting this recognisable, parable-esque language and structure, Perrault forecasts to his reader that what we have here before us is an unambiguous tale of wrongdoing that conveys an instructive, clearly articulated, and unequivocal moral. But is this actually the case? Well, on the one hand, yes, Perrault is explicit about the story's morals in that he hands them to us on a silver platter. We don't need to go looking for them. They're here, tagged onto the end of the story, helpfully demarcated as the moral of this tale and another moral. So, for your perusal, here is the moral of this tale. Curiosity's all very well in its way, but satisfy it and you risk much remorse, examples of which can be seen every day. The feminine sex will deny it, of course, but the pleasure you wanted, once taken, is lost, and the knowledge you looked for is not worth the cost. So, the moral here, as I read it, is mind your curiosity. In the context of Bluebeard and the Forbidden Room, it's telling us, respect your husband's privacy. If there's a locked room that he tells you not to go into, don't! Even if it is giving off an ungodly stench, just trust him. If you go snooping and you find something you don't like, you've only got yourself to blame. It's Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, right? Tut tut tut. Look at what happened to your predecessors when they went about snooping. Curiosity killed the wife. But what about Perrault's second moral? Let's take a look. People with sense who use their eyes, study the world and know its ways, will not take long to realise that this is a tale of bygone days, and what it tells now is untrue. Whether his beard be black or blue, the modern husband does not ask his wife to undertake a task impossible for her to do. And even when dissatisfied with her, he's quiet as a mouse. It isn't easy to decide which is master in the house. This is curious. It's a bit more complicated for us to unpick, and it's here that we realise that perhaps Perrault isn't giving us a straightforward, parable-esque, unequivocal moral after all. So, what can we glean from moral number 2? Well, we're told that this is a tale of bygone days. The events of La Barbe Bleue are situated firmly in the past. Men serial killing their wives doesn't happen in this day and age being the 1690s, and part of the reason men no longer serial kill their wives is because, in this day and age, again, that's the 1690s, men are whipped. They're quiet and submissive as mice. The way men and women relate to each other in marriage has changed since bygone days, but there is one truth that does remain the same. Members of the feminine sex are innately and uncontrollably curious. A modern, enlightened 1690s husband knows better than to ask his wife not to open the door into a forbidden room because he knows it is a task impossible for her to do, to resist temptation. She will compulsively disobey to satisfy her curiosity. Now, I mentioned earlier that Angela Carter, as well as writing her own Bluebeard adaptation, The Bloody Chamber, which we'll get to shortly, also translated La Barbe Bleue for publication in this book. And in her translation, Carter takes this idea that women are curious creatures, forever tempted to their own detriment by the tree of knowledge, and does her level best to dispel it from Perrault's tale. In her translation of Perrault's first moral, she removes the association between curiosity and the feminine sex, thus deliberately avoiding associating curiosity with women. As I've mentioned, Perrault's tale has been translated in many different ways over the years, and when it comes to translating a text, we might like to assume that a translator will try their damnedest to translate a work as faithfully as possible. But this isn't always the case. Carter, for instance, in her translation, knowingly and deliberately altered Perrault's original texts. As Jack Zipes puts it, Carter's translation can be read as a brazen appropriation of his works. She remade Perrault and his tales into something different from what they were. Carter felt the need to misread or reinterpret Perrault to make his tales more palatable to her feminist and political sensitivity. Clearly, she sensed the problematic aspects of Perrault's style and ideology, which she purposely glossed over in her translation. I find this fascinating. This specific case of Carter translating Perrault, but more broadly, how far translation alters the intended or original meaning of a text, whether deliberately or not. I'd love to know what you think about this, so please let me know in the comments. Is it egregious? Or is it part of the telling of folk tales, part of the way stories shapeshift as they're passed down through the generations? As Carter herself said, each century tends to create or recreate fairy tales after its own taste. That's very much what she's doing in her translation of Le Barbe Bleu, and it's very much what she does in The Bloody Chamber. It won't come as a surprise to you that Perrault's is my least favourite of the 3 Bluebeard tales we'll be discussing today, but it's an important starting point. It is one of, if not the, original popular rendition of the tale, after all. It does set a certain precedent. And, now that we have a sense of the moral, or morals, Perrault is trying to get across, we can enjoy watching Angela Carter and Nalo Hopkinson take those morals, tear them apart, and reconstitute them into something far more delicious. But how exactly did they do this? How did they reform this brief, bare-bones narrative into thunderous feminist folktales that would probably make Perrault roll over in his grave? Let's journey forward in time. Let's leave Perrault back in 1690s France, traverse the centuries and swim the English Channel to arrive at the writing desk of Angela Carter, who, in 1979, published what would go on to become her most famous short story, The Bloody Chamber. Now, before we begin, I want to share with you some very exciting trivia that I only recently found out, which is that between the years 1976 and 1978, Angela Carter lived here in Sheffield. She was a creative writing fellow at the university and apparently had an office somewhere in this building, the Arts Tower, and it makes me very excited to think that she possibly wrote some of, if not all of, The Bloody Chamber and other stories here in the city that I call home. But I digress. The setting of The Bloody Chamber is a far cry from Sheffield. Heck, it doesn't even fall within the bounds of England. It's actually set back in France, so over the channel we hop once more, to take residence in a castle by the sea. But this isn't any ordinary castle. It's a living, breathing entity. Later in the story, the protagonist describes being inside the viscera of the castle. It's a place entirely otherworldly, so much so that it seems to shift with the tides, with the light. Just listen to this. And his castle. The fairy solitude of the place, with its turrets of misty blue, its courtyard, its spiked gate, his castle that lay on the very bosom of the sea, with seabirds mewing about its attics, the casements opening on to the green and purple, evanescent departures of the ocean, cut off by the tide from land for half a day. That castle, at home neither on the land nor on the water, a mysterious, amphibious place, contravening the materiality of both earth and the waves, with the melancholy of a mermaiden who perches on her rock and waits endlessly for a lover who had drowned far away, long ago. That lovely, sad sea siren of a place. Other than being an example of the quintessential Carter purple prose ridiculousness that I love, this passage foregrounds one important message. This place, Bluebeard's castle, that our young protagonist must now call home, is not what it seems. It's changeable. It's mysterious. It's isolated. It's here that Bluebeard sequesters his new bride, between walls that only seem half real, there and not there. And it's here that her nightmare unfolds. Now, the structure of the story, in its most basic sense, is very similar to Perrault's. Young woman marries man. He takes her away to live in his home, warns her not to go into murder chamber. She goes into murder chamber, he tries to kill her, she gets away. Spoilers. But in every other sense, Carter's version is very, very different. Her narrative is a decadent cacophony that drowns Perrault's pared-back prose. And her antagonist, her Bluebeard, is a beast of a different cast altogether. In Carter, we see the intrinsic, animalistic, predatory nuance of a man who is, and must remain, in control. If I rose up on my elbow, I could see the dark, leonine shape of his head, and my nostrils caught a whiff of the opulent male scent of leather and spices that always accompanied him, and sometimes, during his courtship, had been the only hint he gave me that he had come into my mother's sitting room, for, though he was a big man, he moved as softly as if all his shoes had soles of velvet, as if his footfall turned the carpet into snow. He had loved to surprise me in my abstracted solitude at the piano. He would tell them not to announce him, then soundlessly open the door and softly creep up behind me with his bouquet of hothouse flowers or his box of marron glacé, lay his offering upon the keys, and clasp his hands over my eyes as I was lost in a Debussy prelude. But that perfume of spiced leather always betrayed him. After my first shock, I was forced always to mimic surprise, so that he would not be disappointed. Carter does so much in these 2 striking paragraphs. We quickly learn that her Bluebeard is a man who must be in control of his wife, must orchestrate her reactions. He infiltrates her private moments, invades a space in which she can be independent, creative and passionate, and forces her to concentrate only on him. He creeps. He lingers. He brings her extravagant gifts, butters her up, and distracts her from herself. The sensual, sensorial tenor of this image strips both characters back to their most animalistic: scent, mating rituals and hierarchy, predator and prey. Now, Beatrice, that's the protagonist, is telling her story in retrospect, meaning that she can look back on their courtship and marriage and realise and recognise what she couldn't at the time, that her husband was a man to be feared. Every priceless gift he gives her, every seemingly romantic gesture works as a form of grotesque and violent foreshadowing. His wedding gift, clasped round my throat, a choker of rubies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat. He, with so much love, filled my bedroom with lilies until it looked like an embalming parlour. He, like a true abuser, isolated her from the people who care about her. I, with my stunning marriage, had exiled myself. Looking back, she can see this. She can see him for what he really was. But hindsight is always 20/20, as they say. When one finds oneself in the impetuous throes of infatuation, it's easy to miss the warning signs. She recalls their first sexual encounter together, describing it as a one-sided struggle, recounting the nauseating way he spoke to her afterwards in the third person. "My dear one, my little love, my child. Did it hurt her? He's so sorry for it, such impetuousness. He could not help himself." But in spite of this, Beatrice recalls clinging to him in response, as though only the one who had inflicted the pain could comfort me for suffering it. The Beatrice of days gone by was utterly beholden to this man, and she confused love and affection with abuse and manipulation. This is such an uncomfortable passage. It's so gross, and we've not even arrived at the torture chamber horror show yet. But we're about to. You know the drill by now. Husband entrusts keys to his wife, leaves the domicile, wife uses keys to open forbidden door. And it won't come as a surprise that what Carter treats us to on the other side of that door is far more explicit, lurid and grisly than anything we get in Perot. Beatrice opens the chamber to find an entire torture complex, replete with medieval torture devices, more marriage bed death lilies, and, of course, the mutilated bodies of her new husband's 3 former wives. She approaches them in turn, one embalmed on the table, strangled to death, one now just a skull flayed to the bone, and one, the most recent one, suspended in an iron maiden, pierced not by 1, but by 100 spikes. Oh God, how recently had he become a widower? How long had he kept her in this obscene cell? Had it been all the time he had courted me, in the clear light of Paris? Like his castle, Beatrice's husband is not what he seems. He leads a double life, killing and mutilating one wife while seducing and preparing the next. Beatrice is in no mood to resign herself to a similar fate, but unfortunately, her husband arrives home earlier than expected. She's had no time to escape and can do little else but watch his car rolling silently towards the closed courtyard gate. So, you can probably guess what happens next. Beatrice's darling husband returns home, realises his new bride has paid a visit to his chamber of horrors, and, not without sorrow, informs her that the only reasonable course of action from here on out is for him to decapitate her in the courtyard. However, just as she places her head on the chopping block, her saviour bursts onto the scene, and this time her rescuer is not a man, but a woman, and not just any woman. Beatrice is rescued by none other than her mother. A rider, her black skirts tucked up around her waist so she could ride hard and fast, a crazy, magnificent horsewoman in widow's weeds. You never saw such a wild thing as my mother, her hat seized by the winds and blown out to sea so that her hair was her white mane, her black lisle legs exposed to the thigh, her skirts tucked round her waist, one hand on the reins of the rearing horse while the other clasped my father's service revolver, and, behind her, the breakers of the savage, indifferent sea, like the witnesses of a furious justice. And my husband stood stock still, as if she had been Medusa, the sword still raised over his head, as in those clockwork tableaux of Bluebeard that you see in glass cases at fairs. This is a superb twist on the tale. Carter's prose is at its most alive and electric. What we get is very much a female rage take on the Bluebeard myth. Beatrice's mother, as if she had been Medusa, renders her husband entirely impotent, stops him from beheading her, and then executes him instead. I love how Carter effectively reconfigures two myths here. The myth of Bluebeard, in which typically the protagonist is rescued by a man, and the ancient Greek myth of Medusa. Likening Beatrice's heroic mother to Medusa, the cursed Gorgon who turns men to stone, associates Medusa, typically a monster, with heroism, power and determination, rather than with monstrosity, cruelty and evil. In this passage, multiple mythological female figures are rewritten in empowering ways. By adapting the story, by making it sparkle with fierce description and an ending that subverts the classic damsel in distress trope, Carter rewrites the Bluebeard tale for a second-wave feminist audience hungry for a fully fleshed female protagonist whose fate is not decided by the men in her life. More than this, The Bloody Chamber is a departure from Perrault's women are insatiably curious and have no self-control narrative. Carter's Beatrice is a protagonist whose curiosity is conscious. It's bound up with her intelligence, her bravery, and her desire for knowledge. In Carter, the Bluebeard tale is not a condemnation of female curiosity. Instead, it is an invitation to knowledge. This re-evaluation of female curiosity thus deliberately undermines conventional interpretations of Bluebeard as an illustration of women's guilt and untrustworthiness. Carter shows that the same story may also serve to celebrate female liberation from oppressive patriarchal structures and articulate a desire for change. The Bloody Chamber is a grotesque, baroque masterpiece. I love it, and hey, if you're a returning viewer to this channel, you probably already know that I love me some Angela Carter. But what you might be surprised to learn is that, of the 3 Bluebeard adaptations we're discussing today, The Bloody Chamber is not actually my favourite. I reserve first place for our third and final entry in this evening's parade of grisly murder tales, Nalo Hopkinson's The Glass Bottle Trick, a criminally undersung version of the tale, and one that takes us over the waves and far away from the castles of France to a humble homestead steeped in Caribbean folklore and dark fantasy. The air was full of storms, but they refused to break. In the wicker rocking chair on the front veranda, Beatrice flexed her bare feet against the wooden slat floor, rocking slowly back and forth. Another sweltering rainy season afternoon. The arid heat felt as though all the oxygen had boiled out of the parched air to hang as looming rain clouds, waiting. Oh, but she loved it like this. The hotter the day, the slower she would move, basking. She stretched her arms and legs out to better feel the luxuriant warmth, then guiltily sat up straight again. Samuel would scold if he ever saw her slouching like that. Stuffy Sammy. She smiled fondly, admiring the lacy patterns the sunlight threw on the floor as it filtered through the white gingerbread fretwork that trimmed the roof of their house. Just spend a second taking in that first paragraph. The hang of the air, the creak of Beatrice's rocking chair, the smell of the wicker. Much like the ominous, shape-shifting presence of the castle under the sea in The Bloody Chamber, there's an external, elemental force at work in this story. The air, full of storms, simultaneously indifferent to the plight of the characters and intimately bound up with their experiences. This storm refuses to break, and so the tension hangs. Now, knowing that The Glass Bottle Trick is a Bluebeard narrative, we might read this first paragraph and feel this heavy tension, this parching, arid atmosphere as a form of discomforting foreshadowing. But that's where Hopkinson comes in and catches us off guard. Oh, but she loved it like this. I adore this change in tone. The use of the "oh." It's like I can hear Beatrice sighing with pleasure as she basks in the heat. I love how the heat slows her down, gives her time to herself to rest. I love how the parching weather becomes luxuriant warmth. There's a peace here that we don't get with the introduction of Carter's Beatrice, who we meet thundering away from Paris to her new marital home. Beatrice seems at home here, living a pleasant domestic marital existence alongside her dear old stuffy Sammy. This is how Hopkinson introduces us to her Beatrice, and it's also how she introduces us to her husband, Sammy, or Samuel. Note how different he feels from Beatrice's husband in The Bloody Chamber. He's not a beast-like predator, an out-and-out figure of fear. He's stuffy Sammy. He feels human, real, and sympathetic. He has none of the masculine prowess that we see in Carter's Bluebeard. He's kind of awkward, weird. We get these great flashbacks throughout the story that show Beatrice and Samuel's courtship, and the first one reveals how they met. He looked shyly at her. "Sorry if I offended, miss," he said. "My name is Samuel." Would be handsome if he'd chill out a bit. Beatrice's wariness thawed a little. Middle of the sun-hot day, and he wearing black wool jacket and pants. His crisp white cotton shirt was buttoned right up, held in place by a tasteful, unimaginative tie. So proper, Jesus. He wasn't that much older than she. See what I mean? Shy, awkward, a bit odd, a bit square, you might say. But this makes him kind of endearing, and he's not attractive. Just a bit dorky, doesn't know how to approach pretty girls wearing his woolens in the middle of summer. But of course, this is not the whole story of who Samuel is. And actually, his clothing here, his buttoned-up shirt, his layers of wool so stiff and tight and inappropriate, is something worth noting. It has a more sinister significance than you might think. Where most would overheat wearing woolens in the summertime, Samuel doesn't, and it's not long before we find out why. But we're not quite there yet. Where we are now is with Beatrice, resting on the veranda as she contemplates some very important news that she is planning to share with her husband tonight. She is pregnant. Her hope is that this news will make her husband very happy, break that thin shell of mourning that insulated him from her after the tragic deaths of not one but two previous wives. I know, what terrible luck! Beatrice says she wished she could make him warm up to life again. He's distant, cold, separate. And again, notice the use of temperature here. Now, we as readers pretty much know why Samuel is distant and cold and separate. We could also make an educated guess that finding out he's going to be a father isn't going to go down too well. But for now, things are okay as she sits by the tree, basking, resting, inhaling the sweet smell of the sun-warmed fruit. She is, however, not alone. For fruit isn't the only thing hanging in the tree. Amidst the branches, something else lurks. The sun reflected off the two blue bottles suspended in the tree, sending cobalt light dancing through the leaves. When Beatrice first came to Sammy's house, she'd been puzzled by the two bottles that were jammed onto the branches of the guava tree. "It's just my superstitiousness, darling," he told her. "You never heard the old people say that if someone dies, you must put a bottle in a tree to hold their spirit, otherwise it'll come back as a duppy and haunt you? A blue bottle, to keep the duppy cool so it won't come at you in hot anger for being dead." Again, keep in mind the heat, the hot anger. In its most basic sense, duppy is a word used across the Caribbean that means ghost or spirit. But, as Alison Rudd explains, a duppy is much more than a ghost. A duppy can be a zombie, someone physically alive but spiritually dead, and a souquillon, a form of vampire or an evil spirit. I love the way Hopkinson leans into this specific folklore here in a way that adds to the horror of the story that's about to unfold. Not only does Stuffy Sammy lock up his wives' bodies in his house, he locks up their spirits and hangs them from a tree in his garden. But all this is about to change. While trying unsuccessfully to stop a snake from stealing birds' eggs from a nest in the tree, Beatrice accidentally knocks the two bottles from its branches. The two bottles in the tree fell to the ground and shattered with a crash. A hot breeze sprang up. The snake slithered away quickly, two eggs bulging in its throat. The bird flew off, sobbing to itself. Nothing she could do now. When Samuel came home, he would hunt the nasty snake down for her and kill it. She leaned the pole back against the tree. The light breeze should have brought some coolness, But really, it only made the day warmer. 2 little dust devils danced briefly around Beatrice. They swirled across the yard, swung up into the air and dashed themselves to powder against the shuttered window of the 3rd bedroom. And I bet you can guess what, or who, is locked up in there. This is a pivotal point in the story, a catalyst for what's to come, and a key theme is made explicit: the premature end of gestation by an aggressor. It's not too big of a leap to make. We have the snake, the mother bird and the egg. We have Samuel, Beatrice and their unborn baby. If this symbolism is anything to go by, and it is, we know that Samuel will seek to put a violent end to his wife's pregnancy. But why? What motivates Sammy to kill his wives and their unborn babies? Hopkinson gives us a unique and complex answer to that question. First and foremost, we have to acknowledge that this man, for all his awkwardness and shyness, displays a plethora of abusive tendencies. Even before they're married, Beatrice complains to her mother that Samuel takes her on these long, boring drives, always taking me away from other people. This is how he isolates Beatrice. It's more subtle than whisking her off to a remote castle by the sea. It's slowly but surely disengaging her from her friends and family, from society and connection. But as well as needing control over his wife, Samuel also needs control over his legacy. She went outside as often as possible, even though Samuel didn't like her to spend too much time in the sun. He said he feared that cancer would mar her soft skin, that he didn't want to lose another wife. But Beatrice knew he just didn't want her to get too brown. When the sun touched her, it brought out the sepia and cinnamon in her blood, overpowered the milk and honey, and he could no longer pretend that she was white. He loved her skin pale. "Look how you gleam in the moonlight," he'd say to her when he made gentle, almost supplicating love to her at night in the 4-poster bed. His hand would slide over her flesh, cup her breasts with an air of reverence. The look in his eyes was so close to worship that it sometimes frightened her. To be loved so much! He would whisper to her, "Beauty, pale beauty to my beast," then blow a cool breath over the delicate membranes of her ear, making her shiver in delight. For her part, she loved to look at him, his molasses-dark skin, his broad chest, the way the planes of flat muscle slid across it. She imagined tectonic plates shifting in the earth. She loved the bluish-black cast the moonlight lent him. Once, gazing up at him as he loomed over her, body working against and in hers, she had seen the moonlight playing glints of deepest blue in his trim beard. "Black beauty," she had joked softly, reaching to pull his face closer for a kiss. At the words, he had lurched up off her to sit on the edge of the bed, pulling a sheet over him to hide his nakedness. Beatrice watched him, confused, feeling their blended sweat cooling along her body. "Never call me that, please, Beatrice," he said softly. "You don't have to draw attention to my colour. I'm not a handsome man, and I know it. Black and ugly as my mother made me." "But Samuel—" "No." Shadows lay between them on the bed. He wouldn't touch her again that night. Beatrice sometimes wondered why Samuel hadn't married a white woman. She thought she knew the reason, though. She had seen the way that Samuel behaved around white people. He smiled too broadly. He simpered. He made silly jokes. It pained her to see it, and she could tell from the desperate look in his eyes that it hurt him too. For all his love of creamy white skin, Samuel probably couldn't have brought himself to approach a white woman the way he'd courted her. I couldn't help giving you such a big quote. I try not to, in general. I try to be concise, but this is too good, and there's too much important context here. Firstly, we get more of a sense of Beatrice's naivety. She seems to mistake Samuel's possessiveness, his obsession over the paleness of her skin, with love. To be loved so much, she thinks, as he has his way with her in bed, his body working against and in hers. We also learn about Samuel's hatred for his blackness in this passage, and this is crucial to our understanding of his motives. He gets defensive when Beatrice compliments his black skin and cares more about his wife looking lighter, as white as possible, than about her well-being. The last paragraph here that explains how Samuel behaved around white people, making silly jokes and simpering and smiling too broadly, really reminds me of Mrs. Turner, a character from Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, my analysis of which you can find here. Mrs. Turner is a black woman who covets whiteness, and this impacts the way she relates to other black people. The lighter the skin, the more respect she has for the person. Now, from what I can remember, no direct violence ensues from Mrs. Turner's colorism in that novel, but when it comes to Samuel, his body image self-objection leads to destructive consequences. Over time, it results in a repression of his inner rage and the desire to object any trace of his blackness, and this leads him to violence. Samuel's ultimate motivation for killing his wives seems to be their pregnancies. He doesn't want his lineage, his blackness, carried on. But how does Samuel's rage and consequent violence come to be realised? What changes? Not long after breaking the duppy bottles, Beatrice notices that the AC has stopped working, and she's worried because she knows Sammy won't like this. He likes the house kept cold. The whole house was warmer than she'd ever felt it. Then she realised she could hear sounds coming from the outside. The cicadas singing loudly for rain. There was no whisper of cool air through the vents in the house. The heat, the tension, is staggering. The sweltering weather front is on the cusp of breaking. Everyone, everything, down to the insects, can feel it. We are arriving at our crescendo. It was becoming thick and close as a womb inside their closed-up home. More imagery here of pregnancy and gestation, and the suggestion that the heat is turning the house into something alive, something that can give new life. Samuel keeps it cold to maintain stasis, to prevent life and growth, but things are hotting up. Beatrice checks every room to see if she can work out what's up with the air conditioning. Every room, of course, but one. Now, we all know what happens next. Beatrice enters the forbidden room to find the bodies of Samuel's previous wives. But what I love about this ending, and one of the reasons Hopkinson's adaptation is my favourite, is that the murdered wives are given agency. It's interesting to compare how Hopkinson does this with how Perrault and Carter very much don't. In La Barbe Bleue, the murdered wives are nothing. They're gruesome props, essentially. We know nothing of who they were, nothing specific about why they were chosen, why they were killed, or when. Now, in Carter, we do get more than this. We learn details about the three women known to have been murdered by Bluebeard. Carter gives these women lives and presences beyond their mortal remains, beyond their eventual collective status as victims in a chain of horrible crimes. But they are, ultimately, victims. And this is something Hopkinson seeks to rectify. Rather than stumbling upon their gruesome remains and retreating in horror, Hopkinson's Beatrice comes face to face with the women that preceded her. A sound, like a sigh, whispered in through the door she'd left open. A current of hot air seared past her cheek, making a plume of fog as it entered the room. The fog split into two, settled over the heads of each woman, began to take on definition. Each misty column had a face, contorted in rage. The faces were those of the bodies on the bed. One of the duppy women leaned over her own corpse. She lapped like a cat at the blood thawing on its breast. She became a little more solid for having drunk of her own lifeblood. The other duppy stooped to do the same. The two duppy women each had a belly slightly swollen with the pregnancies for which Samuel had killed them. Beatrice had broken the bottles that had confined the duppy wives, their bodies held in stasis, because their spirits were trapped. She'd freed them. She'd let them into the house. Now there was nothing to cool their fury. The heat of it was warming the room up quickly. Remember I said that Hopkinson makes really effective use of temperature in this story? Well, this is the culmination of all that, of the hot pre-storm skies, of stuffy Sammy in his stuffy woolens in the middle of the stuffy summer, of his singular desire to keep his entire home at a dead cold temperature. Now, their spirits released, the fury of his duppy wives cannot be cooled. As I mentioned before, one iteration of the figure of the duppy is the Souquillon, a kind of vampire who feels a burning rage and is believed to transform itself into a ball of fire and fly through the air in search of victims, often babies, so as to feed on their blood. It is associated with a particularly female form of rage. Look at how Hopkinson takes the figure of the Souquillon and uses it to give vengeful agency to Samuel's murdered wives. But also look at how she adapts this folkloric entity, giving us a more nuanced Souquillon figure. As Rudd explains, the Souquillon has been traditionally seen as a vile folk figure, an evil, anti-maternal vampire, preying on young babies, a misogynistic figure that functioned to regulate women's mobility. But this isn't the impression I get from the Souquillons in The Glass Bottle Trick. These women don't prey unprovoked. They were preyed upon themselves, and now they want their revenge. They don't murder babies. Their babies were murdered. And rather than regulating women's mobility, they drive it upwards, providing the story with hope that this man can be brought to justice. Just as Carter refigures Medusa into something less monstrous and more heroic, so Hopkinson takes the Tsukuyon and transforms her from a misogynistic baby-killing vampire into a symbol of revenge, justice, and power. Samuel's dead wives are coming back from the grave. But, you might be thinking, what about his living wife? What, in the midst of all this, will become of Beatrice? Unlike the other two stories, Hopkinson's Beatrice isn't rescued. No brothers or mother rush to her aid. It's also suggested that not only is she in danger of her husband, but of his duppy wives too. She tries explaining herself to them and can't quite work them out. Was that understanding on their faces? Or were they beyond compassion? The story closes without giving us an answer to this. For all their darkness, La Barbe Bleue and The Bloody Chamber give us satisfying resolutions. We're allowed to rest in the surety that the beast has been vanquished, and the protagonist is able to move on. Hopkinson's rendition, by contrast, leaves us stuck in the crescendo, far from a fairy tale-esque resolution or a parable-esque moral conclusion. Rather, this adaptation leaves us in the lurch, leaves us without the resolution we might expect from a Bluebeard narrative, and that forces us to reckon with the horrors the story presents us with. Horrors that go beyond the domestic, and beyond the folktale. Hopkinson's Bluebeard, her Samuel, can be read as a product of colonial horror. Hopkinson makes explicit his pain, his self-loathing, and the lacerating effects on individual identity that comes from living in a rigidly racialised society. This is a man who balks at his blackness to the extent that he murders his wives when they come to be pregnant so as not to carry on his family line. Hopkinson masterfully adapts the Bluebeard tale, examining the horror of the legacies of colonialism by translating it into the domestic. And by leaving her story unresolved, we're left to face the fact that this isn't a bygone era or a castle far, far away. It's a boiling hot, closed-in present, far too close for comfort. An unresolved crescendo that doesn't allow its readers to turn away. I began this video by asking two main questions. Why is Bluebeard so very enduring, and how does its moral, its main message, change over time and between authors? I think the first question has a fairly simple answer. The base narrative, what happens, the structure of the story is recognisable to a readership, but how and why it happens, the playing out of the violence and the motives behind it, are primed for experimentation, allowing an author to put their mark on the tale. So narrative-wise, it strikes this appealing balance, but the story's popularity goes far deeper than this. Bluebeard's villainy is timeless. He is the archetype of abuse, the ultimate misogynist. He changes shape over the centuries, but he represents a fundamental and unchanging horror faced by victims of abuse. The protagonist, by contrast, is a relatable, universal victim at her core, and we might enjoy taking solace in the way she is often spared at the end of the story, and in the way Bluebeard gets his comeuppance. Then there's the question of morality, of how the moral of the story changes between authors, a fairly thorny issue that often refuses us a clear answer. Carter is right in her estimation that each century tends to create or recreate fairy tales after its own taste, but this is only part of the picture. Bluebeard is a fairy tale that spans not just centuries, but countries, cultures, and racial and ethnic identities. It has become, under the hands of different writers, a powerful vessel for examining, portraying, and raging against a range of abuse dynamics, horrors, and injustices that plague us still. These stories warn us against such things, but they also demonstrate how easy it is to be blind to them, how easy it is to miss the horror, even as it stares you in the face, or waits for you, just beyond the door. I'm so curious to know which of these Bluebeard adaptations is your favourite, and I also want to know which other adaptations I should read. Please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed learning about Bluebeard, the archetypal misogynist, learn more about his counterpart, the demon lover, and how he influenced everyone and everything from the early modern witch trials to American author Shirley Jackson by clicking here next.